time to have a seat, grab the last donut, have some coffee. We're going to get started. Can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me, Rob? Can you hear me? Okay.
Okay, it's time to get things started again. So please take your seats and we'll get the show back on the road. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Let's have a seat. Getting started.
Do what you're doing.
Okay, we're going to get started now on our last panel presentation of the morning.
Stand up. Tell him to stand up. Don't look at me. Okay, I get it.
Okay, how's this? Good? Yeah? Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone for being here today. We are going to talk a little bit about making heritage visible, building networks through stories of place today. I'm Madeline Tudor. I work at the Field Museum, and I love the Calumet region and all of the heritage that it represents. So today we're here to celebrate, explore, and share the rich and varied heritage that is embedded throughout the bi-state Calumet landscape. While this heritage exists in everything we see in the region, from the building we're in today in Hegewisch to the sites we're going to explore this afternoon, there are particular institutions within the region who have taken on the responsibility to steward and interpret the region's stories through objects, archives, narratives, oral histories, artwork, and photographs. As Mike mentioned in his opening address this morning, earlier this year, the Calumet Heritage Partnership, together with the Field Museum, established a new CHP group to bring these heritage organizations together. The Calumet Museums, Galleries, and Local History Network is one of CHP's new initiatives to form groups around common interests to facilitate events and activities that celebrate the region's natural, cultural, industrial, and recreational heritage. Stemming from the regional themes and priorities identified through the Calumet National Heritage Area Feasibility Study, this group or network will work to build regional identity and showcase the region's heritage by connecting the work of the organizations to the core regional heritage area themes of nature reworked, the Calumet's diverse landscape, innovation and change for industries and workers, and crucible of working class and ethnic cultures. In addition to connecting with and developing these themes, the network provides a structure for the organizations to connect with each other. We hope to strengthen visibility for all organizations, illuminate and facilitate partnerships between and among organizations, and deepen thematic messaging and programming. One function of the network is to bring together organizations that might not normally work together. There are an estimated 40 museums, galleries, and local history centers in the Calumet region. While they vary in size and scope, most are small local history centers or archival institutions that could benefit from partnerships with similar institutions and with those that are larger in scope or have more diverse programming. Conversely, the network provides the opportunity for larger institutions to learn from those local experts who have a deep understanding of the local patterns that make up the regional tapestry. We are just in the process of forming a steering committee, and some of you members are here today, including Serena and Jason, and others are here. You might not know it yet, but I haven't reached out to you quite yet. You'll hear from me soon. Initial ideas and products for this network include a museums, galleries, and local history guide, which would be in print and online, and a Calumet Heritage exhibition, which could have multiple partners, travel to different host organizations throughout the region, and culminate in an exhibition at the Field Museum. In a short time, we'll hear from our keynote speaker about how powerful stories are in helping us to understand how the Calumet region has been shaped, and how powerful stories are in deepening connections to the nature and people who have shaped it, and in creating a vision for the region's future. Now, we're going to learn about the work of two heritage organizations and museums, galleries, and local history network members who are surfacing stories of how people's connections with the natural and built environment have shaped the Calumet landscape and how they can shape its future. So I'd like to introduce Serena Ard, until very recently known as Serena Sutliff. She just got married, and she's a curator of the Westchester Township History Museum in Chesterton, Indiana.
Yeah, I really confused a lot of people by getting married. Okay. Can you put my PowerPoint up? That's okay. So I'm here from the Westchester Township History Museum, and a lot of you who are not from Northwest Indiana are probably thinking, what the heck is the Westchester Township History Museum? We are a very small local history museum in Chesterton, Indiana. Porter County is divided up into townships. Westchester Township is the north central space in Porter County. We are lucky to house both the Indiana Dunes State Park as well as the headquarters for the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, which makes life very wonderful for me, because we are a storytelling museum, but we are also, we are actually part of the Westchester Public Library. So we are a tax-based institution, and in the museum world, that is a wonderful thing, having a consistent finances coming through. But it also means that as part of the public library, everything that we do and everything that we house is free and open to the public, available to the public. We are a research institution. We have several archives that I'm going to discuss in a minute. But what I wanted to talk about first was my title, A Region at Odds. The reason I titled my presentation today with this is because in 2013, in the summer of 2013, I opened an exhibit called Saving the Dunes, the First 100 Years. And it chronicled the history of the Save the Dunes movement from the earliest efforts to get a national park created in the 1910s to today, and what kind of efforts are being made to revitalize or save the environment as we have it. Oddly enough, or I found it very odd, about a month before the exhibit ever opened, I had several letters published in the local newspaper lambasting me for not presenting the opposite story as well. Those who opposed the creation of the National Lakeshore, those who opposed the creation of the state park, and the exhibit hadn't even opened. And if you're a fan of publicity, you know, even bad publicity might be good. I don't know. But I took it very personally because I am a big fan of presenting both sides of the story. And so what I learned very quickly in my job is that Northwest Indiana, specifically Porter County, has a very adamant, very vocal group on both sides of the fence. And trying to represent both and make both equally mad is pretty much my job. The library director, when I first started, had a great quote, and I've used it ever since then. As a public library, we are equal opportunity offenders. So Westchester Township is important, in part because we have the state park, in part because we house the National Lakeshore. or the headquarters for the National Lakeshore, but it's also important because of the story that it tells. It is, as Indiana's motto is, we are the crossroads of America. The railroads that came through here connected the East to Chicago. The people that came through here in Chesterton either stopped or moved on to Chicago. It was a place for we had railroads sent to market all of the agricultural goods to Chicago. We had industries that sent stuff to Chicago. But one of the things that I do to make people mad is I do a program on the Prairie Club, which was a very early Chicago-based organization that helped save the Indiana Dunes. And I started out when I give a talk to Northwest Indiana people, and I say, we have to thank people from Chicago for saving the dunes. You would think that I had just brought out their coffins and was ready to just bury them right then and there. But then, you know, if you think about it, Chicago is also responsible in part for destroying the Indiana Dunes. So there is a give and take. There is two sides to every coin, and there are two sides to every story, including that of the dunes. We have so many opposing viewpoints in our area, even today. I don't know if you've heard anything about this banquet center being built in the state park. Our little local paper, which has been in existence since 1882, publishes an article called The Voice of the People. And it is letters that people write in, whether they're good letters, whether they're bad letters, whether they're grammatically correct or not, and they are adamant on both sides of the story. Put it in banquet center, people are bullying us into wanting not to have it, yada, yada, yada. And there are people, don't put in the banquet center. It is a national heritage. It is, you're going to destroy the dunes, which we've been fighting for 100 years. So it really is two very different opposing viewpoints, and we get both of them. The state park, the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, both had opposing viewpoints. People didn't want a state park. They didn't want the National Lakeshore. They didn't want a national park in the 1910s because locals didn't want to give up control. They didn't want the feds to come in and control who could go into the park. And so there has been a 100 years long battle over how to save the dunes and what to do with them. Particularly if you talk to anyone in our area about leasebacks, be prepared to talk to them for a long time. Not kidding. So how do we actually study these things in our museum? We are lucky enough to house several archives, including that of the Prairie Club. By holding the Prairie Club archives, we have photographs of dunes that no longer exist. The Prairie Club originally started coming to the Indiana Dunes in 1908, and we have photographs of those dunes in 1908 because of the Prairie Club archives. We also house the Richardson archives. William and Flora Richardson were Chicago residents who were part of the Prairie Club. William Richardson was by trade the head chemist at Swift Meatpacking Company, and by avocation, he was a photographer and ornithologist. So we have thousands of pictures of the dunes from him in the early 1920s. We house the local history archives, which includes our local paper photo archive, which all of these pictures are from. Whether our local newspaper accidentally forgot to return photographs to the owner or whether they actually took them themselves, we house them. So we have photographic documented evidence of how our area has changed, of how the dunes have changed, of the incoming of industry like Bethlehem Steel, of protests. If you didn't know, our local NIPSCO plant was going to put in a nuclear facility late 70s, early 80s, and this was the protest against the nuclear facility. The Save the Dunes Council, which is now Save the Dunes. And on the bottom, pictures of items from the very first park movement in the 1910s from the Prairie Club archives. We do a lot of local history stuff, so we have oral histories, our local newspaper, we have a researcher on staff, and that's kind of how we do our thing, is we access the local things that we have, and we are lucky enough that we have a lot. And we are also lucky enough to be part of a group called the Museums of Porter County. And this group is a compilation of different cultural and historical organizations, including an Ogden Dunes Historical Society, Beverly Shores Museum, Portage Museum and Historical Society, the Brower Museum of Art at Valparaiso University, the Chesterton Art Gallery, the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore, and more. And so with our little group, we have worked together on a lot of different projects, including last year, we were very lucky to be part of the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore's 50th anniversary. And we created a partnership with them for all of these organizations to do an exhibit utilizing the National Lakeshore's collections and or telling a story about the history of the National Lakeshore. And according to my connection at the National Lakeshore, it was the first time the National Park Service had ever allowed one of their parks to open what I call their vault. It's because it's as difficult getting in there as it would be to get in a bank vault. Open their vault to local history organizations and lending out their collection to our little tiny little places to do exhibits and to do research and show their collections to the public when the National Lakeshore doesn't really have a space available to them for exhibits. And so it was a very, I hope, it was a very successful collaboration with the Museums of Porter County and the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. And it has not stopped because I still hit them up and say, hey, do you have something about these people that I could borrow for this exhibit? And they're very nice and they say, yes, we do. And I'm like, all right, good. So having that access to that kind of collection is very important to us. So this is where we're housed. We are part of the Brown Mansion. It is an 1885 Victorian house. So we do tell the story about the house. We do have an exhibit space, but we also do research. People are allowed to come in, conduct research on the history of environmental conservation in our area, specifically the Indiana Dunes. We house the Richardson Archives, the Prairie Club Archives, the Chesterton Tribune Photo Archives. We've had scholars come through. We've had producers, video producers come through. We've had a lot of different people come through and utilize our archives. And because we're a library, the only fee that is ever charged, we do charge 10 cents per copy if you need a photocopy, but we will scan and email for free, unless it's like 500 pages and then we might have to work something out. But you are always welcome to contact us and access our information. That's it.
Thank you, Serena. Please welcome Jason Berry, Community Development Director for the Village of Lamont, Illinois, and current board president of the Blue Island Historical Society.
Thanks, everybody. I feel like I'm back home in the Calumet. It feels good. I've been away for a while in Lamont. I live in Blue Island at the start of the CalSAG, and now I work at the other end of the CalSAG in the Village of Lamont. And it's been wonderful, but I'm really happy to be back here. So like lots of us, Blue Island might have an image problem. We've chose to sort of embrace it and have fun with it and just try to be the toughest damn community around. People aren't always appreciative of our history. Here, like some vandal tried to get creative when the library started dismantling its library and throwing the walls into a dumpster. But we do have a lot of great hidden history around. This is a project that the Historical Society got involved in. We knew there was something special underneath this wall. That's at the corner of Broadway and Old Western Avenue in Blue Island in a part of town called, part of Old Western that was sort of lost when New Western was built in the 1960s, and part of town that I spend a lot of time in. This was there. This was 1974, the history of the Mexican-American worker mural. This was done by Ray Padlan, Vicente Mendoza, Jose Nario, organized by Augie Salas. A really critical moment in Blue Island and actually in sort of mural history in Illinois. We knew it was there because it was falling apart. It got whitewashed in the 90s, like a lot of outdoor art. It wasn't maintained, and eventually the property owner painted over it. It wasn't anything, it wasn't a political message or anything, it was just a maintenance issue. And so you could see, picture me there peeling up part of the paint away. And we decided one day, we were drinking at the Rock Island Public House, and we decided it was like time to get this done. So, 4 friends organized under this banner, La Causa, and started to raise money for this mural project. We knew it was there, and as you can see here, once we got the project rolling, this is actually really sort of the first step. We were able to sort of acid wash away the mural, and it found sort of a hidden mural underneath the hidden mural. It says right there, reserved for mural painting on history of Mexican community, forbidden by Blue Island City Council. So this painting was really important. In '74 when they started to do it, the Blue Island City Council came down and said, you can't do this, you don't have a sign permit. And the artist said, we don't need a sign permit, we're making art. And they said, yes, you do, you're advertising for the Mexican race. And stopped it. They lost. They went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld their right to do a mural. And so when I talked to the board about the Historical Society about this project, it's just like we have to get involved because it's reserved, mural painting on the history of the Mexican community. I really wanted to kind of hone in on that part, that this was a history project in many ways, and that we had to be involved in this history project. It was really critical for us. So here in the acid wash here, it's was painted. So that was sort of the mural that was painted under the mural in sorts. And so I was just like thrilled to the gills to see that come back when we blasted the site. I never thought I'd ever see it. So this was the mural in 1974. This is the mural today. It was dedicated around Labor Day of 2017. I'm sorry, 2016. There were some changes, and those, with everything else, had their own sort of controversy. We added boxcar camps in here. Those are important locally. Most of the Mexican immigrants that moved to the Blue Island in the 19-teens came because of the Rock Island Railroad. They would take boxcars, take the trucks off them, and create boxcar camps. Even the earliest Mexican-American births in Blue Island, if you go through the records, say like Rock Island Railroad Camp as their address. So that was added by some of the artists that live in Blue Island today. We brought Ray Patlan, one of the original artists, back. He lives in California now. And we did get some criticism for making changes, for not sort of slavishly reproducing the original mural. And he just simply said, I'm not the only author. I have new artists working with me, and I want them to also be a part of this mural. The other ways the Historical Society got involved, we provided photographs and sort of archival materials. Here's a photo on your right is of the dedication in the 1970s, and then on the left we kind of, the dedication today. Providing things like old newspaper articles and stuff like that to help people figure out how that mural worked originally. This comes from the Sun Standard. It's my segue into my favorite topic, beer. So Blue Island Beer Company is one of our great brand ambassadors, not only for the city of Blue Island, but also for the Blue Island Historical Society in sort of subtle ways. So if you're sipping on this beer, you're drinking a bit of Blue Island history, I guess. They went to the archives and stole the masthead from an old issue of the Sun Standard, which was a local newspaper, and made that one of their beers. We provided postcard views and photo views. This was the old Blue Island Brewery. There were many breweries in Blue Island at one point. We think the first lager beers served in Chicago were actually lagered in Blue Island because we had a hill. So they'd bring the barrels down and lager them in the Blue Island hills. And so if you go to their website, they recreated this view, along with adding a bridge, which Blue Island's well known for, all of our great bridges. So of course they named the beer 5 Bridges, which celebrates the railroad crossing over the CalSag. And we've been doing a lot lately to sort of push that bridge thing. We reopened the Chatham Street Bridge as part of the CalSag Trail. Those bridges are in the CalSAC Trail logo. I got my buddy Toby Ramos across the street to do the city sticker for this year. So I told him to throw the word Bridgetown into it a little bit to sort of kind of push the bridginess of Blue Island. You know, and celebrating all, this is when the nickel plate came through, and Blue Island's always been this sort of destination trail town as well, serving trails in lots of different ways. We're working with Metra. We're providing archival support for Metra as they redo the Vermont Street station, the old Rock Island station. They're changing the fenestration and some of the doors and stuff. And we also work with the City of Blue Island in a way maybe a lot of historical societies do. We do a banner program on Western Avenue, so we provided a lot of the images there. This one's neat. It has a Pullman Porter in here, an old Rock Island image. So we wanted to also go through our archive but make sure we found some images that show that Blue Island has always been a diverse community. So we made sure that was sort of part of some of the banner program, and as well as celebrate our architecture and sort of Blue Island as place. I'm not wearing it today, but Blue Island has a ton of merch. We have Blue Island Brewmaster t-shirts, we have scarves. The Brewmaster logo comes from an old piece in the History Museum. It was the front piece for the fire department's uniform. So I'll stop here. I know I'm supposed to have 10 minutes. If you do anything today, though, make sure you write this down. Go to vimeo.com, mybi for My Blue Island. That's my friends Kevin and Sarah Brown. They're doing a video series about Blue Island. There's one about the brewery. There's one about St. Donatus Church. And then there's one about this mural itself, a 20-minute piece that's really excellent if you want to learn more about it. So thanks for having me. I'm glad to be back. Thanks.
We have 5 minutes for questions.
So I'm Paul Labovitz. I'm the superintendent at the National Lakeshore. Serena, thanks for saying nice things about us.
We don't often make it easy to work with us. I'll just say it that way. But the salvation and destruction theme, sort of tied to the last panel, makes me think of the comment about the South Shore double track, which is the most exciting and terrifying project for me as the superintendent of the Lakeshore. Insofar as it's great to think that it's an hour trip from Northwest Indiana to the Bean and back, but it also worries me from, we heard some of the cultural and social potential impacts, gentrification, but as a place that also houses some of the great ecological resources of the country, all I can think of, having worked in Indiana for 25 years and lived there now for 3, is that it's not a very strategic state when it comes to development. And so my worry is that every undeveloped private land within 15 or 20 minutes of a South Shore station will be housing. And it will be housing that's developed with not, how do we move those people efficiently and effectively to those train stations? It'll all be all about making money in the short run. And in 10 years, it won't be a 15-minute ride to that station, it'll be a 40-minute ride. And so my comment is made for this group interested in the region's natural and cultural heritage, is to make sure that doesn't happen. We have an opportunity this happens everywhere. Why would we let that happen here in our region?
Actually, I think Paul would be a better person to talk about it. I will say that in my experience in the museum, we get a lot of tourists in the summer because of the attraction of the Indiana Dunes, whether the state park or the National Lakeshore. And we get asked quite often, why is it a National Lakeshore and not a national park? And my response is, I don't know, but it's up for national park renaming, so why don't you call your congressman and tell him to vote? Yeah.
So briefly, interesting question. So I tell people the National Park Service cannot support pending legislation, so we don't have an official opinion. So my joke is that it's to save us money because the signs will be smaller. The change changes absolutely nothing as far as our regulatory authorities. It's strictly a semantics issue, but within the national park system, there are 417 units of the national park system, and there's 30 different names: National Lakeshore, National Battlefields, National Parks, National Rivers, National Historic Sites, National Monuments, and the public doesn't care. But internally, you'll hear a lot, and during our centennial, you hear, visit the 59 national parks, which meant don't go to Indiana Dunes. So the national park system has a hierarchy, and the national parks are the crown jewels.
Right.
Now, I argue that all 417 are crown jewels. Pullman National Monument, one of the newer units, is a crown jewel. They're in the national park system. So it means nothing and it means everything.
I actually believe it does make a difference to visitors, because when they want to go on a vacation and they want to go see national parks, they're not necessarily looking on a map for a national lakeshore. They're looking for your national parks. And as it is completely semantics, but semantics mean a lot to people, it's whatever.
So, can I make one more comment? Yeah. There are 4 national lake shores. Sleeping Bear Dunes called me and said, Indiana Dunes is becoming the Yoko Ono of national lake shores.
Can I quote you on that?
You can do that. Well, Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles, right?
Does it have any budgetary implications? Do you get higher priority?
No.
Okay.
Too bad.
But more people will spend money in the area around the national
Correct.
park than around the national lake shore.
Correct.
More people may come.
Correct.
I wanted to speak to Paul's point about, what happens to that development around, the double track, even the Westlake extension of the South Shore. And really that it kind of comes back, I believe, to really looking at how development occurs, because you do know it's coming and you can get in the position of that always being no and against or encouraging, whether it's federal, smart growth, smart design, whether it's federal jurisdiction, whether it's state, even whether it's local, because a lot of our zoning, our building codes, our design, that's influenced by our local leaders and our local boards. And they are not looking at things of how design incorporates into the natural area or the heritage and culture architecturally of what's around here. And so we really need to start there with encouraging our leaders to look at that and put those things in place before it's too late. We see a lot of redevelopment happening, and we look like, why was that ever built? That they're taking down. But someone actually approved that, in the 70s or 80s or even the 90s, and now we're like, that was a horrible idea because it has no association with what was already there. We also need to look at, especially in a growing environment of deregulation nationally and federally, EPA is being weakened. Section 106, the National Historic Preservation Act, the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit is not in the budget that's come out of the administration, which shall not be mentioned right now. But, these are things that give us some teeth in design and investment, and they're being removed. And so we really need to work, push our state legislatures, as well as put people in those positions that we know can hold those views, because a lot of the things that impact Northwest Indiana, they get lost in translation when our leaders go down there to Indianapolis and they're not into consideration. So we really need to start doing as some of our predecessor organizations done, is really organizing and getting that collective voice about what Northwest Indiana will see in the future in terms of development.
I want to thank Madeline and the new CHP group for helping us to learn some more about what they're doing in Blue Island and Westchester. So thank you very much. We have one last thing on our schedule, and that is our keynote speaker. And here to introduce him is Sherry Meyer.
Hello. So I'm the Illinois Vice President for the Calumet Heritage Partnership, and Tiffany, who was our moderator earlier, is the Indiana Vice President. At any rate, back in March, I was having what I thought was a distinctly out of Calumet internet experience. I was looking for a wireless speaker to use when I conduct tours. And along the way, going through archival emails, I see in one of the emails a link about interpretation. Well, I went down that rabbit hole. And in the rabbit hole, I found a biographical description about a guy who was doing interpretation work around the world. And I'm reading the details, and I go, I'm reading about the Calumet. This person is from the Calumet. And then I continue reading, it says, born in California. Oh, man. And then the next sentence after that said, raised in Lansing, Illinois. I knew it. I knew I was reading the Calumet. So this person grew up in Lansing, Illinois, and he spent a lot of time in the river down there. He had handcrafted rafts that he used to float himself down the river in. At least once it fell apart in the middle of the river. He came home many a day, muddy from sliding down the banks of the river. He became an avid fisherman at many sites around the Calumet, going out with his grandfather and spending time learning about the nature of the Calumet. As he moved toward adulthood, he began to discover birds and birding as a passion, and that has remained a lifelong passion. When this young man completed his bachelor's degree, his first job after college was working at Sandridge Nature Center. He eventually went on to do volunteer work over in the dunes. And eventually he went back to school and got his doctorate. He now teaches as a professor of conservation, park management, and interpretation at Kansas State University. And when I contacted him in the spring to let him know about the work to create the Calumet National Heritage Area, he was, to say the least, excited. And he accepted my invitation to be our keynote speaker very, very promptly. So I'd like to introduce to you that kid from the Calumet, Ted Cable.
Thank you very much. As Jason had mentioned, just like him, it's really great to be back. My mother still lives in Lansing, right across the street from Lansing Woods, and my dad for decades took the South Shore into the loop right from the Headwish station here. So seeing the train go by a little earlier was really a feeling of nostalgia for me, and rather sentimental actually to be back in Headwish and along the South Shore line. So yeah, I literally experienced the little Calumet River many times, and I came home with parts of it on me, I guess, much to my mother's chagrin there from Lansing. But I'm so happy to be here, and already so inspired by meeting you and hearing the wonderful stories of the work that you're doing here. It is really a heartwarming experience for me. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about interpretation and maybe some of the opportunities for interpretation here in the Calumet region. I've based my presentation to you today on one of the books I've written called The Gifts of Interpretation, and I have copies back there if anybody's interested, along with a few other things that I've done. So as we go through this, I hope, I'm not going to talk yet about very specific sites and real nuts and bolts sorts of things. We may have the opportunity to do that later this afternoon, I hope, as we go to specific sites. But I hope to just sort of paint a broad picture, a general picture for you about some of the gifts of interpretation. And park interpreter is kind of a funny word, you know. People don't know what it means a lot of times, and so I don't know if you can all read this back there, but society, of course, when they hear the fact that you're an interpreter or you teach interpretation, they immediately think foreign language, right? If you know somebody who's an interpreter, you might think they do this all day, just kind of get to goof around, you know, hang out with nature and have a lot of fun in the mud and the rivers. Many of you are probably of the age like me that you can remember this guy, Ranger Smith and Yogi Bear, and some of the people think that's what we do. We hope our boss thinks that we're talking and presenting to large crowds. Sometimes some of us think we're great orators like Dr. King. And of course what we all do, like probably most of you, we sit in front of a computer all day on a messy desk, and that's really what interpreters do. So there is a lot of confusion about the word interpreter. And in one of the books I've written, I paraphrase Winston Churchill, who said about the word democracy, he said, it's the worst possible word except all the others. And that's sort of how I feel about interpretation. You know, it's confusing. People don't really know what you're talking about when you say interpretation, park interpretation, but it is a good word, and we do interpret and assign meaning, as we'll talk about in just a second, to things that are foreign to people, and so in that sense we are interpreting. So the earliest uses of this word that I'm aware of anyway are from the late 19th century and early 20th century. John Muir, who many of you may recognize that name, great conservationist, largely responsible for Yosemite. He wrote, "I will interpret the rocks, learn the language of the flood, storm, and avalanche. I'll acquaint myself with glaciers and wild gardens and get as near to the heart of the world as I can." So he used the word interpreting rocks, not interpreting Spanish or French or Chinese, but interpreting a rock, interpreting an avalanche, interpreting a garden. And then another very influential character in our profession of interpretation, a guy named Enos Mills, who grew up in Kansas, where I'm currently living, ran away from home as a teenager, young teenager, like 14 I think, went to what's now Rocky Mountain National Park, or Estes Park, and started taking tourists, really paying tourists, up Long's Peak on nature walks, guided walks up Long's Peak, doing interpretation for money, basically. So in a sense, he was one of the early professionals in our field. But here's what he wrote in a very influential book in 1920 called Adventures of a Nature Guide. The aim is to illuminate and reveal, and I'm going to use the word reveal a lot in the next 40 minutes, the alluring world outdoors. A nature guide is an interpreter of geology, botany, zoology, and natural history. Okay, we're not the botanist, we're not the geologist, but we're an interpreter of those things. So those are both very early uses of the word. And Enos Mills' famous book was published in 1920, and he was a big deal back then. He actually went to the White House. He would give nature presentations to President Taft. People knew the name Enos Mills, and so he was very influential in terms of spreading this vocabulary and this term interpretation. He also was instrumental in the establishment of the national parks in 1916, and as was alluded to, they just had the centennial last year, and I was privileged to be a part of that with the National Park Service in helping them vision the next 100 years of interpretation in that agency. But Enos Mills knew Stephen Mather, who became the first director, and so forth. And so the word interpretation sort of infiltrated, you might say, our national park system, and then eventually spread to other places. So what is interpretation? And I'm going to try not to make this like a lecture, but I'll give you just a couple definitions. And there's actually a handout that has been prepared for you as well that has some definitions on it. But one of the classic definitions was this one by a guy named Freeman Tilden, and this was sort of the Bible of our profession, interpreting our heritage. Freeman Tilden was an interesting guy. He wasn't a naturalist by training. He was a Broadway playwright and a journalist, but he linked up with the National Park Service in the 1950s and went around and looked at the interpretation that was happening in our national park system and then wrote about it in this classic book called Interpreting Our Heritage. And anyway, you can read, I won't read off the screen to you, but here's his definition. And what I do want to highlight though is you see the word there again, reveal meanings and relationships, and then the rest is sort of how you do it, original objects, illustrative media, and so forth. This is a more contemporary definition from our professional society, which is the National Association for Interpretation. It's a little bit more succinct. It's a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. And as you can see, I highlighted emotional and intellectual here. And as you'll see over the next few minutes as we talk, I get really excited and I really sense the need to prioritize the emotional connections. For decades, we as a profession stressed teaching people facts about nature, and if they just learned about it, then they would take care of it. And I think we're finding now that it's more the heart more than the head that we need to address. And so we'll talk more about that. The other thing I want to highlight out of this definition, because it's important, is a mission-based communication process. It needs to be purposeful, and it's not what sometimes I just call the pet the bunny stuff. You know, maybe you've been to those kind of programs where you go to some place and they have a little, you know, play, you can pet the bunny or something along those lines, sort of metaphorically speaking. But it should be mission-based. It should support the mission of the agency or the organization that is sponsoring that interpretation and then facilitating it. So it's purposeful. So, based on those, I just want to emphasize that interpreters are meaning makers. They're revealers. They help people see things that they wouldn't otherwise see. And that's like interpreting a foreign language, isn't it? You're signing meaning. If I was up here speaking Farsi or something, I mean, unless you spoke that, it would just sound like gibberish, right? It would have no meaning to you. But if you had an interpreter that would assign meaning to the sounds coming out of my voice, then that would make sense, right? And so it's not too different talking about interpreting a prairie or interpreting a wetland that is very foreign to people, and to reveal the meanings of that resource. One other little nuance of interpretation, here's another definition, but this one emphasizes the fact that it's educational and recreational. Because people are going to be at your interpretive sites at leisure, right? They're there voluntarily. No one's making them go to this. And if they don't like your campfire program, they can get up and walk out. Or if they don't like the interpretive trail, they can turn around and walk out. And so people are visiting your site or your website, even your interpretive website, and with a click of a button they can leave, right? So it has to have sort of a recreational or fun or engaging component to it. Most people, you'll get a few, but you're not going to certainly get the masses to show up for a lecture on entomology or the geology of a park or something necessarily. You know, the average people there that are vacationing or on holiday in your park or at your historic site probably need to have a bit of engagement, entertainment, fun, because they are at leisure and they're there voluntarily. So it has to have that. And then we find also, so keep that thought in mind, and then people remember, and I can't vouch for these percentages, I've read different ones and different versions, but stick with the general point. I mean, don't quote me on these percents, I don't have a lot of faith in them myself. But the point is, people will remember a little bit about what they read, they'll remember a little bit about what they hear, but they remember a lot about what they do, and then more than anything, they'll remember how they felt. Just think in your own life, you know, you remember your most embarrassing moments, right? And maybe your happiest moments, right? I mean, that just gets ingrained in you. And if you went to a site and you were made to feel stupid, or if you were embarrassed in some way because you didn't know the right answer to something that the speaker asked, or if you had a particularly joyous, inspirational, aha kind of moment, you'll remember that. So people will remember how they felt and then what they did. So you think about that, you think about the fact that this is also sort of recreational, and you see that, and I know some people sort of hate when you do make up words like this, but you are sort of, and many of you, I mean, I know we have museums, people here, libraries, people from all sorts of institutions, of course, parks. We are sort of in the edutainment business because it's, and getting that balance right is hard. It's really hard. Interpretation is an art. It's an art that requires practice, and we all hopefully get a little bit better every time we do a program. And to balance that, you don't want to just do it just the fun stuff. What wasn't mentioned, I guess, in my introduction, my first job was with Cook County Forest Preserves at Sand Ridge. My second job was with Lake County, Indiana Parks and Rec. And so I worked in Crown Point and at Deep River and a lot of those places way back in the 1970s. And I think the grist mill had just closed when I was there from the original use. No, I'm exaggerating, but not that old. But you know, we have to get that balance. I started to say it, Lake County. One time, my job as the interpreter, by the way, nobody, in those days, we didn't use that word. Like I said, it started with National Park Service. And when I worked at Cook County and Lake County, I was the naturalist, the park naturalist. In fact, until I went to Purdue University for my master's, I didn't even know, I was one and I didn't know it. You know, I didn't realize there was such a thing as interpretation because our agencies didn't call it that. We called it being a naturalist. Well, anyway, I would sometimes have to show, like, and this will really date me, but like Three Stooges movies in the campgrounds. All right, well, that's 100% entertainment. That's not too educational, right? the mistake that's made more often is that people get strictly educational without that, and it gets to be a dry, boring, lecture, and people don't come back. So finding that balance is hard. It's a hard thing to do. All right, this actually comes from, this was generated by the National Park Service and some of their training materials. It's the interpretive equation. I think we just felt like, we as interpreters felt like we needed to have an equation to make us feel smarter, like we're real scientists, We have an equation, It's like putting on a white lab coat. You just feel smarter, right? Or glasses. And so we have an equation, so we must be a real science, But actually, it's just a metaphor for what happens in the interpretive process. And so if you remember your math, you do what's in the parentheses first, right? So in order to make this happen, you need to have a knowledge of your audience, case of A, knowledge of the resource, of course, you need to know what you're talking about, and knowledge of who you're talking to, and then the appropriate technology, am I going to give a talk, am I going to do a brochure, am I going to do a video, there's pros and cons to each of those. And then that leads to interpretive opportunities. And we'll say more about each part of that equation as we go along for about the next 30 minutes or so. It's important to say that leads to interpretive opportunities, and the Calumet region has an infinite number of interpretive opportunities. That's one of the things that's so exciting about the work that you're doing here. And we'll see some of those this afternoon. But you notice it doesn't say, it doesn't lead to interpretation. Because one of my, in fact, this also came from a national park colleague who generated a lot of the training for national park rangers in interpretation. He would famously say, we should not inflict interpretation on people. Right? And that's true, and maybe you've had that happen. When I was at Purdue University after I left the Calumet area, I was teaching high school at Lake Station High School for a little while, then I went back to Purdue to get my master's. And when I was down at Purdue, getting my master's and PhD, I lived in the little town called Battleground, Indiana. Some of you may know Battleground. It was before there was a state park there or anything, but there was the little Tippecanoe County Battlefield Park that I lived by it. And as was mentioned, I'm an avid birder, and also have a dog. I'd like to walk my dog in the park and stuff. And I didn't want to talk to 1812 soldiers from the War of 1812, who sometimes were there and they wanted to inflict interpretation on me. And so you probably have all been in that situation, right, where you kind of don't make eye contact, you just try to walk away and pretend like I'm looking at a bird in the top of the tree, because I didn't want to have I love, the War of 1812, very meaningful story and all that stuff, but they were good interpreters, and they were passionate interpreters, and that's one of the hallmarks of being a good interpreter, is being passionate, and they wanted to inflict interpretation on me. So we don't want to do that, though, right? Okay. So then here's the Gifts of Interpretation book. So in the remaining time that I have here, we'll talk about a few of the gifts that you can give, each of you individually. You don't have to be a professional or whatever, but all of you in your roles of people who love the Calumet region, who love to share stories of the Calumet region, all of you are in a position to give the gifts that we're going to be talking about. And there's 15 of them in the book, but don't worry, we're not going to do all 15. We're just going to do a few as time allows here. The first is that we give the gift of relevancy to the people that come to us, to our audiences, and to spark an interest. These are all principles that are couched as gifts, and so our principle is to spark an interest. Interpreters must relate the subject of a visitor's life. And you might think, well, of course, right? That just seems like common sense. Relate to your audience. right? And but what I found is, and maybe you'll find, or maybe you have found, that common sense isn't very common, and at least in my field of interpretation. And so I literally know places that have presentations that will go out to the grade schools in the morning, and they'll go out to the senior citizens group at night, the same canned presentation, right? And even now, I'll get job announcements from my students, and a lot of times in there will say, the ability to memorize a script. I go, oh no, not memorize a script. We should be targeting our audience. It shouldn't be the same spiel for everybody, right? And so even though this seems so obvious probably to all of you, trust me, it's not always practiced, And so what's some practical applications of this? We need to know, going back to that case of A, we need to know not just our audience demographics. Are they young? Are they old? Are they local or are they transient? But we need to know their motivations, their satisfactions. Why are they here? What are they expecting from their visit to whatever site we're interpreting? And then try to match our interpretation to that. And there's lots of ways, sort of beyond the scope of what we can talk about today, but there's lots of ways to do that and to sort of do it on the fly and to be able to relate to people. What this, well, just for an example, just a quick, I think you guys get this, but for an example, decades ago when I worked at the Sandridge Nature Center, I used to talk about the geology of the lake shore here and the ancient dunes, which then became our highways, because when they were dunes, we had the swell and the swale, right? The way I remember the story, and the bison and the Native Americans and the settlers, they all were up using the dunes because they were high and dry and everything was low and wet and mucky in between, and those became our highways. So Highway 12, Highway 20, Highway 30, those were all on the tops of ancient dunes. At least that's the way I remember the story. But I do remember that when I would talk to my audiences at Sandridge, they were almost all local. We had very few transient people just stop there. They were all local people. So I could talk about landmarks like in Lansing. If I knew that some of them were from Lansing. I said, now you know Burnham Avenue, where you go up to Ridge Road there, there's the Reformed Church and the cemetery there. You notice how you're going up a hill? That's an old dune, right? So, I mean, I could relate, just simply relate that way. If I knew that I had out-of-state people, if I was out by the interstate at a nature center, obviously you would do something different. Other examples, this means you probably can't just slap up labels with scientific names, you know, saying bur oak and then the scientific name or the scientific names of plants. These people don't speak Latin. And I understand the importance of scientific names, you know, from a museum standpoint, from maybe an arboretum standpoint, for certain audiences there. But, you know, Joe Blow and his family coming there, we find that not only obviously they don't know what the scientific name means, but it actually can turn people off and makes them feel stupid, like, well, this isn't meant for me, obviously. This is, you know, it was actually a disconnect. It actually has a negative impact by emphasizing that. And your institution may require that, you know, for scientific reasons or whatever, and that's fine. But then I would interpret binomial nomenclature or whatever, and scientific names are good if you interpret them. I mean, if you can tell how it got its name, you know, Arctostaphylos or something, and what it means, and I mean, there's great stories in that, but that requires interpretation. Don't just be throwing around, you know, the scientific names won't mean anything to people, right? So it's not relevant. Okay, I need to hurry along here. So there's another gift we give is the gift of meaning. Sometimes I do interpretive trainings where we'll have T-shirts, and the T-shirts will just say "so what" on them, because from my perspective is that if you're not answering the so what question, if you are just labeling an artifact or labeling a tree or something, you're not really doing interpretation. You need to answer the so what question. We live in the information age, right? And my problem is not that I don't have enough information, and I don't know if you can relate to this. My problem is I have too much information, right? And people know that I love birds, and so they're always giving me I love nature in general, but especially birds. So they're always giving me books to read and magazines to read. And say, oh, Ted, you should read this. Oh, Ted, you should read this. And I'm a slow reader, and they sort of build up on my counter, right? And it's sort of like an eating disorder. I get all this reading material, and I feel bad every time I look at the stack, and then I kind of purge it, you know, like get rid of it, and then it all comes back again. My problem is too much information, and I think I tell my students, many of whom are going to be park rangers with the National Park Service or other agencies, I say, you know, if you just envision yourself going out to, say, the Grand Canyon or someplace and being just another source of information, you know, standing there spewing out facts about the canyon or any other resource, the world doesn't need you. You know, you can go online right now and find out everything you want to know about the Grand Canyon, you know, the different rock layers, how old it is, the birds that are there, the trees that are there. You could probably read journals or blogs of people that hiked the Bright Angel Trail yesterday. They probably have a webcam. I can't swear to it, but you can probably actually go online and see it as long as the sun's up. I mean, you can find out everything you needed to know. But what we do lack is someone to answer the so what questions and to assign meaning to that rather than just giving out the facts. So we do need the meaning makers. So this is something from old Freeman Tilden, that he always said that information is just the raw material of interpretation. It's the raw material. So sure, we need to have facts. We need to know the resource, that case of R in my equation there. But we need to go beyond that and know the compelling stories associated with the resource and then share those with people to help the people find meaning in what they're looking at and answer that so what question. Going way back to 1920 in his book, Enos Mills said the chief errors likely to be made by a guide, an interpretive guide, are to become too booky, to compel like the school teacher the learning of lessons. There's been too much of this dulling lessons business. That was in 1920, and so I'm here now almost 100 years later. I would say that still is true of our profession. Historically anyways, it was too much about, we just got to teach them. We teach them about the geology, we teach them about the birds, and we're too booky and not enough about the connections, the emotional and the meaningful connections to that resource. Okay, another gift that we give is the gift of provocation. And I said that all interpretation should be purposeful, and we can actually provoke people to act and to think differently through interpretation. And some of the things we can do is to provoke stewardship. We can use interpretation as a management tool by provoking behavior changes in people. There's all kinds of management benefits that can be addressed through interpretation that have been addressed successfully. It's been used to reduce vandalism, poaching, littering, other destructive behaviors. It's increased the distribution of use. It's softened the impacts of use. It's literally saved lives. And I can't emphasize this enough. The Corps of Engineers, there's this Bonneville Dam in Washington. On the Columbia River, people were drowning because they were anchoring their boats in a wrong way. I don't understand the physics of it, but they were anchoring their boats in such a way where the boat would get sucked under, and people were drowning. And so they did sort of the standard park thing, which was going to put up a sign saying, "Don't do that." And of course, people were still doing it and still drowning. And they turned their interpretive staff loose on, and they started doing other things with graphics, visuals. They took the messages to the bait shops and off-site and did some more creative things rather than just putting up the sign by the boat ramp, where people tend not to read signs anyways at a boat ramp because you're too busy trying to back your boat down and all that. You know, it's always chaotic. It's often chaotic at those places. Anyways, and it literally, I confirmed this not long ago because I tell this story often. There still has not been a drowning because of that after they gave it sort of that interpretive treatment. Now, you know, that's almost sounds too good to be true, but at least it is for now. Interpretation has saved parks by making the connections to the local people. Just a quick example that goes way back, but it's a good example of a small park in Tennessee. It was a historic site. And I guess they were going to close up the park. There was no real public support for it, and it wasn't being taken care of and so forth. And then sort of as a last-ditch effort, the interpreters decided to let the kids blow off the cannon on Saturday afternoons or whatever. And they loved that. And the parents, that sucked the parents in. You know, there's a Danish proverb that says, if you take the child by the hand, you take the mother by the heart. And there's a lot of truth to that, and you can use that, you know, and exploit that dynamic, I guess, by taking the child by the hand and then getting the mother's hearts. And just through that simple little activity, there became more engagement in the park and so forth. And there's other examples of that too. So this looks really complicated, and I just bear with me for a second. This is a theory. It's called the theory of planned behavior. But I just want to show you how this works. And this works for everything in your life. This isn't just an interpret thing. This is all of us, why all of us act the way we act. Okay, so we have a behavior that we want to change, right? Maybe we want to increase recycling, as was mentioned here. Or maybe we want to increase trail use or some other, something else, photography or whatever here, and access. So our behaviors that are anything that's thought about even quickly are based on our intentions. Our intentions to behave in a certain way, you have to believe that you can do it, right? Otherwise you wouldn't do it. And you have to have the ability to do whatever it is, to recycle, to compost, whatever behavior you're trying to either promote or discourage. And then it's based on attitudes and norms. And you know, for the longest time, even the National Park Service, but then also a lot of other agencies, we always focused on changing people's attitudes. And we wanted to teach them about beliefs and evaluations and change their attitudes. But the social scientists, not related to natural resources at all, but sociologists showed us, we're saying in the literature, there's not a strong link between attitudes and behaviors. There were studies done of hiring practices of minorities and of women. And they would ask employers, how do you feel about hiring minorities and women? And some would say, sure, I like to do that. And then you would check and they didn't do it, you know. So their action didn't match up with their attitude. And even vice versa, to be honest. I mean, some would even say, no, I would never hire a woman for this job. And yet they would, you know. So there was just no statistically significant match between attitudes and behaviors. Well, that's, if people cared in our field, that really should have shaken us, and it did. I mean, there was a famous article written called The Folklore of Environmental Education, because we had this belief, like a religious belief, that if we just taught them about nature, they would take care of it. And what we found, and what the beauty of all this is that a scientist from the University of Illinois came up with this and started looking at subjective norms, and we're finding that norms are very important, often more important than our attitudes about something, right? You all understand what norms are? It's like what we think other people think we should do that are important to us, right? And every one of you, think about yourself, and me too, I'm part of this, obviously. You're on some kind of continuum between, some of you may just not care so much about what norms people think about you or whatever, and you're just going to do what, act in accordance to your attitudes. Others of you are very much about pleasing other people, what your neighbors would think and what your social group would think and so forth. And norms are very important. And we're somewhere along here. You know, up at this end of the spectrum would be sort of maybe the Dennis Rodmans or the Miley Cyruses of the world or something. I don't know who the good examples are anymore, but martyrs. People, who's that?
Martyrs would be a good example.
Yeah, martyrs, exactly. Non-normative, yeah. And so we have this whole range here of things. And so what this tells us is that we really, and this is to me very exciting, we need to emphasize the norms more, and when we're trying to get people to act differently at our sites here in the Calumet region, or as we do interpretation. So, let me just say, so often what we do is we complain, we'll call attention to the problem because we want sympathy, we want support, right? So we get up and wring our hands in front of our park audience or historic site audience that, you know, we have this terrible problem with littering. We picked up 35 tons of litter last month in the park. Please don't litter. Well, what we're doing is we're making the bad behavior seem normative. You know, I mean, I know this used to happen to me when I used to go to church, you know, and as a child, I would hear, you know, essentially someone say, you know, the preacher, pastor, priest person say, everybody's out there doing such and such. Don't you do it. And I'm thinking, you know, if everybody's doing it, it must be pretty good. You see how that backfires? And we do that in our park world all the time, though. You know, everybody's destroying something, whatever. Don't you do it, you know? So we sort of shoot ourselves in the foot. I'm going to show you a real-world example from one of our national parks, Petrified Forest National Park. This was their original message, anti-theft. You know, many people go to Petrified Forest National Park and they take pieces home with them, right? And that's a real problem with the resource. And it said your heritage is being vandalized every day by theft losses of petrified woods of 14 tons a year, mostly a small piece at a time. This we sensed as we worked on this as almost not only telling people that everyone's doing it, but you even tell them how to do it. Just take a little piece of wood at a time, kind of, you know, it's almost a normative. Then the Park Service revised their message and it says, please don't remove petrified wood from the park in order to preserve the natural state. And that gives a reason, too, for the rule, which always helps when you want compliance. So this is better. This was a better statement by the Park Service. And now what the Park Service is doing, or at least the last time I checked in, is now they have pledge cards, where when you come in the gate, you're asked to sign a pledge card. Well, that's a normative act, too, because how do you refuse to sign a card saying, I'm not going to steal, right? And you have a carload of kids and your wife, right? So all of a sudden there's normative pressure. Even if see how this has nothing to do with your attitude? You may want a piece really bad, but there's this normative pressure not to steal, and it's worked tremendously because now if dad steals, and by the way, dads are the worst. I know people that worked at Petrified Forest, and they told one of my colleagues, said that they found an 80-pound piece in the trunk of some guy's car. You know what the dad did? He said, "Oh, my kid must have put it in there." And this is just like a little kid, you know? There's no way. I mean, here the dad throws the kid under the bus. Anyway, but now through the use of pledge cards, you're appealing to people's normative behaviors to change them. And I just show, I know you can't read this, but this is my mom and dad's bill from Commonwealth Edison there in Lansing. And companies are using this now. They're comparing my parents' energy consumption with all their neighbors on their block. And here's how much they can save if they do certain things, and they can compare. So they're actually trying to apply normative pressure, like, gee, all your neighbors are not using as much as you know, you wasteful people, you. And to try to change behaviors. And so we can do the same thing. And a lot of my little examples there were sort of negative, stealing and littering and so forth. But we can also provoke positive behaviors too. And using norms, now what a lot of parks are doing, they're saying things like 98% of our park visitors obey the speed limits, obey the speed limit too. I hope you'll do it too. Or 90% of our park visitors use the trash receptacles. Please use the trash receptacles. That makes you non-normative if you're the person not doing what you should be doing, right? It puts the normative pressure on the correct behavior. And so, again, we give the gift of provocation. We can provoke new ways of thinking and new ways of acting. Another gift that we give, and I'm just going to have to go really quickly here, I see, because of time, but we give the gift of joy. Interpretive sites in the Calumet region. This is a manufacturing area here, but you guys have the opportunity to literally manufacture joy. Just think about that. That is profound. You manufacture happiness. And it's an opportunity, it's a privilege. I could tell you more about Disney, but at Disney, no matter what job you hire on at the Disney Corporation, at a site like Disney World, your number one responsibility is to facilitate a happy experience for your guests. No matter if you're an accountant or a guy that cooks hot dogs or whatever. You might not know this, and again, maybe I don't exploit this information, but they have what they call bad day cards. And Disney employees walk in the properties. If they see someone not having fun, babies crying, long lines, or whatever, they have these cards that they can give you to go to a front of a line, to get a free ice cream, because they're all about manufacturing joy in their parks. It's probably the most important quality of life. Many of you probably know about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, right? That very popular book. And in that book, if you've read that book, you may recall where he said that when people are on their deathbeds, nobody ever says, "Gee, I wish I would have spent more time at the office." Right? What do they wish for? Or what do they, as they reflect on their life? Oh, I wish we would have taken that vacation. I wish we would have gone to the Grand Canyon. I wish we would have spent more time out hiking around the Calumet area. I wish we would have spent more time fishing at Wolf Lake. I mean, and that's the part and so roughly we sleep a third of our lives, we work a third of our lives, and then there's that other third that's leisure time, and that's the part that all you get to affect in the work that you do here, in the work that you're doing as part of your community. That's the most important part of life when you define quality of life. It's those opportunities that you're creating for people as you protect habitats and ecosystems here in the Calumet region, and as you provide access to those with trails and with kayaking and canoeing on some of our rivers. You're literally creating joy, and I tell my students, our country is founded, the pursuit of life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness, right? And you guys are the pursuit of happiness people. And I would say that to you, this audience, to the extent that you work here in the Calumet region to help create a national heritage area here, you're the pursuit of happiness people. And you're right up there with all Mother Teresa's and everybody, I think, because it has health impacts and other really high quality impacts. That doesn't mean that it's recreational, but again, it's also about learning, and just in the interest of time, I'm just going to go through this real quick. There's lots of benefits of recreation to your communities, and then it also requires meeting the needs of people. And so here's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Some of you may have seen this. And in order to create happiness, though, you have to meet people's various needs. And so obviously they need to have their physiological needs met. There are safety needs. You need to feel safe when you're out in nature. Otherwise, you won't be enjoying the aesthetics of the Calumet region if you're scared. Love and belonging needs. I used to lead bird walks and things around here, and I would always wonder about why people would show up, but they didn't seem interested in the birds. And they weren't bad people or anything, but they weren't jerks or anything, but they just wouldn't even look at the birds. Well, then it occurred to me, you know what? Maybe they just wanted to belong to the group. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they live all week alone, and they just on Saturday morning they wanted to come out and be with other people. It may have nothing to do with the birds, but I was in a position to help meet the belonging and love needs, even at Sandridge Nature Center or a place like that. Self-esteem needs. This is one of the most rewarding parts of being an interpreter. And those of you that have worked with kids, especially, although this applies to adults too, you see kids that are sort of the misfits, right? The ones that aren't part of the group, the kids that aren't the cool kids or whatever. A lot of times they'll come to our interpretive programs with school functions and be dragging along, and you can sort of, with some sensitivity, you can tell which kids are which. Not long ago I was speaking to Delaware State Parks, and I was making this point, and afterwards a guy came up to me and said, oh, I got to tell you a story about the self-esteem thing. And he told me this story of he had a bunch of boys out on the trail as a scout group or church group or something. And he would normally do this anyway, but he stopped at a place where they have like a little scavenger hunt activity, and he would send them out into different directions to find something and blow a whistle or whatever, and they'd come back. Well, sure enough, there was one of these kids that seemed to have a self-esteem problem, didn't really belong with the other kids, and just from posture and everything, just sensed that the kid maybe was struggling with that. So just, he went around and he told each kid which direction to go, but he sent this kid in the direction where he knew there was a cave. So 5 minutes happens or whatever, he blows a whistle, and they all come back, and he goes around the circle, what'd you find, Johnny? And I found a feather, or I found a bird's nest, or I found a flower, I found a leaf. And they get around to this kid, and what did you find? He goes, I found a cave. A cave? You found a cave? Wow, let's go check it out, you know? And all of a sudden this kid's like the hero, you know? And they all go over there and discover this cave that this kid discovered. You know, that kid might tell that story to his grandkids, you know? I mean, that might be a lifelong, maybe I don't want to get too exaggerating here, but maybe it's a life-changing thing. But if nothing else, that's a story that may stick with him for years about the day that when he was a little boy, he discovered a cave. And isn't that simple? Isn't that just by being sensitive how through interpretation we can meet these needs? Now there is a new version of Maslow's. Anyways, that's just a joke. But anyway, okay. Well, so I'm going to go through these real quick because I see that I'm really behind on time here. So I just went through how we can meet all those needs, and how you can change lives every day here in the Calumet region, sometimes by the busload through interpretation. The gift of beauty, I apologize for going quickly, but it looks like I don't have too much time left. We should instill in people the ability and the desire to see beauty in their surroundings. Sometimes we have the opportunity of giving them spine-tingling events, but more often than not, this is sort of my professional mission statement. My goal in everything I try to do and all the books I write and so forth is to help people see beauty in things that are not pretty. Almost everybody appreciates the Rocky Mountains. They can sort of take care of themselves in many ways, but they don't necessarily see the beauty in a marsh or in a prairie. And so my goal is I try to help people find beauty in what's pretty. So I wrote this book about Illinois, driving between Chicago and St. Louis on I-55, and I have little stories all the way along I-55 where you'll often hear people say it's nothing but cornfields, right? Once you leave Chicago, it's nothing but cornfields. And so my goal was to try to help people see the beauty in that drive. I did one for Kansas as well, where nothing in Kansas, it's only flat. I even had friends tell me that they drive through Kansas at night because there's nothing to see there when they're going skiing in Colorado. And I thought to myself, that does it. I call myself an interpreter. And that's actually how I got started in this. And so I wrote that book first as an anecdote to that boredom. But yeah, we have these subtle beauty, and we help people see. And so Aldo Leopold compared it to art. So we have a simple painting here by Winslow Homer. Maybe we all will recognize it. Hey, that's kind of pretty, and we sort of get it. Then you have these paintings. I've been told this is like hundreds of thousands of dollars or something it's worth. And I don't see the beauty in it because I don't understand I guess, modern art. And so, but I can kind of get this, right? To me, this is sort of like the Rocky Mountains. This is like wetlands to a lot of people, or prairies. You know, and what do I need? I need an interpreter to help come alongside me and tell me why this is valuable and what's beautiful about this. What I don't need is a snooty art curator, you know, making me feel stupid for not appreciating this work of art. And yet some of us environmentalists and conservationists, we do the same thing, don't we? I mean, have you heard that? I certainly hear it. All those idiots, they don't appreciate the little Topeka shiner fish, you know, or they don't understand why we need to save a butterfly or something. And so we're sort of like the snooty art curators with people who don't see the beauty in the things that we see the beauty in. So we're surrounded by beauty here in the Calumet region, and it's just a matter of seeing it with different eyes and looking more closely. Einstein said there's only two ways to live your life. One is though nothing is a miracle, the other is everything is. And I think most good interpreters fall into that latter group. So right outside the church here, just looking at the leaves and the grass, there's miracles out there if you just see them with different eyes, and that's our goal. So I want to get to the last gift, and it looks like I have just a few minutes. I have a little information on how to interpret mundane miracles. First, you have to help people notice them. Then you help people understand them, why it's beautiful. And then you help people become reconciled to them. And this reconciliation is a word that I only fairly recently started using. I was reading a book, Ernest Hemingway book, A Movable Feast. And he wrote this. He said, the trees were sculpture without their leaves. When you're reconciled, I thought, reconciled, that's great. What does that mean? And I actually looked it up in the dictionary, you know, the old dictionary, the one with pages in it, not online. And it means to be in harmony with. And I said, that's exactly what we want to do. We want to get people in harmony. And that's what you want to do here, right? In the Calumet region. You want people to be in harmony with their surroundings and with their neighborhoods. And and these things all overlap. And so by showing people beauty, we also create joy. I have a statement here, we can make happier carpenters in the Calumet region. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, the philosopher, artist, John Ruskin, he wrote, during his life, he would give art lessons and drawing lessons to the people in his village. And he had some critics who said, you can never make a carpenter into an artist. And he said, my goal isn't to make a carpenter into an artist, it's to make happier carpenters. And I think that's what we want to do here in the Calumet region, right? We don't necessarily need to convert everybody to necessarily be an activist like we are, or to go out and learn all the names of all the birds or all the plants. We just want to make happier residents of the Calumet region. And then this also, by doing joy and beauty and all this warm fuzzy stuff, it's also very practical. And it results in stewardship, because as Jacques Cousteau said, people will only protect what they love. And I show a picture of a steam engine there, because that's actually a perfect example. There's no real good reason to have a steam engine left. I mean, they're not functional, they're not efficient, and so forth. Why do we have steam engines? Because people love them, right? And so we preserve them. And if we get people to love monarchs, we'll preserve them. So I tell my students, I say, and I would say to you as well, you're sort of the eHarmony of nature, right? We want you to get people to fall in love with nature, get them to meet, get them to see the beauty in it, and then they'll take care of it, then they'll learn everything on their own later. Okay, this is my last gift, and we'll wrap up here. And that's, you guys have a wonderful opportunity, an amazing opportunity, more so than many other places where I'm asked to talk, to give the gift of hope. And you know the world is a dark and stormy place, and some of that was alluded to already today. But as interpreters, you can give the gift of hope, which is the antidote to despair. The repeated refrains of nature give hope. If you're working at a historic site, or if you're working with cultural resources, human creativity, integrity, courage, as demonstrated in history, can give hope. And those are the tools of interpreters. You know, after 9/11, at 9/11, I happened to be out of town traveling, but I would have students. I did have students that night and the next following days call or email me and say, you know, Dr. Cable, should I give the BAT program tonight? Or should I give the STAR program tonight, or the butterfly program, or whatever? Because it almost seemed trivial in light of everything that happened. And I would say, yes, we need it now more than ever. Because on September 12th, the ducks were still migrating, the butterflies were still migrating, flowers were still blooming, right? Historic stories of courage and of overcoming obstacles were still existing. And I think people found hope and healing in the repeated refrains of nature. And we as interpreters were uniquely positioned to tell those. Hope's critical to conservation and personal health. You know, a lot of people have given up probably, or had over the years given up on Lake Calumet, or on the Little Calumet River, or on the Grand Calumet River. And I know I work in Africa quite a bit, and that's the biggest threat to conservation there is the loss of hope. People already just have given up on certain forests, certain species. So that's really, it's critical. And as I was preparing for this, I just went online and looked what I could find out about Lake Calumet today. Man, what a great story of hope. I mean, I'm inspired by it because when I used to go around Lake Calumet in the 1970s, early 1970s, when I first got interested in birds, I'm not exaggerating, literally. I mean, it didn't happen to me, but it happened to my friends where they would literally find dead bodies. It was a dumping ground. There would be smoke coming up from spots out there around Lake Calumet. I mean, it was terrible. Now, there were still some birds there, which is what drew us there. But now you have herons nesting, you have fish, you have bald eagles, as it was alluded to earlier, nesting, clean water, red-shouldered hawks. I mean, it's amazing. What a story of hope, the story of just of Lake Calumet, of what it was in the 1970s and what it is today should give everybody hope. Again, hope isn't just, again, in just time, I'll let you read this. Hope isn't just bubbly optimism that everything's great, everything's going to be okay. But it's more of a matter of faith over the horizon, you might say. Admiral Stockdale was the longest held POW in the Vietnam War. And when he was asked how he survived, he said, oh, that was easy. The guys that didn't survive were the optimists. You know, I mean, I think, optimists? Why? And he said, well, the optimists would say, we'll be home by 4th of July. We'll be home by Thanksgiving. We'll be home by Christmas. And those dates came and went, and it just crushed him. But he said, I wasn't optimistic, but I had this deep faith, this deep hope that in the long run, things would work out okay. And that, I think, illustrates what we as environmentalists, conservationists, community activists, everybody that you represent here, you have that opportunity to say, yeah, we have problems. We're not stupid. We're not naive and think that everything's wonderful. But we have this deep hope that change can happen and that we're on the right path. And I'll just briefly begin time is that doesn't mean being doom and gloom. People don't want to hear doom and gloom messages, and we shouldn't make children to become worriers or warriors. That's another one of my favorite quotes, and I wish we had more time to talk about the role that hope is much more effective than talking about doom and gloom and the problems and how bad everything is in the world. So for excellence in interpretation, you need to give the gift of love. And that's not only loving nature, that's the easy part. Everybody here probably loves nature or loves your heritage and your culture. But to love people, that's the hard part. And to love people enough to want to share that with them. And then to give the gift of hope. I mean, a hopeless interpreter would be sort of an oxymoron, right? Why would you bother if you think there's no future, right? So those are the essential ingredients in being a good interpreter. So thank you for all the gifts that you give here in the Calumet region.
Okay, thank you, Ted. Thank you very much. We don't have time for questions because we have to be out of here by 1 sharp because there's something else going on. We need to.
If I may tag on to that. Yeah. If I may tag on to that, we are going to spend the afternoon with Ted, and we're going out to envision interpretation in the Calumet, so there'll be a lot of time for questions.